Avengers Endgame did a lot of things right, and one of them was blending moments of humor with moments that ripped our hearts out and stomped all over them. Yeah, Marvel Studios is really good at that. There were plenty of pop culture references and obvious jokes, but there were also some subtle Easter eggs and references that you might have missed. In this video, we're gonna go over some of the funniest Endgame moments that some fans didn't notice. Okay, so maybe the God of Thunder spent most of Avengers Endgame looking slightly less than majestic, but let's not forget that Thor is a character straight out of Norse mythology, which was why it was so hilarious to see him interacting with another mythological creature, although we didn't see it on the big screen. Following the destruction of Asgard in Thor RAGNAROK and Thanos and the Black Order claiming so many Asgardian lives in Avengers Infinity War, Thor was feeling a little bit down, to put it mildly. In Avengers Endgame, we learned he had settled into a town called New Asgard, but that his own people rarely saw him. Instead, he sequestered himself inside with Korg and Meek to drink beer and apparently play Fortnite. Hey, he's clearly on a journey to find himself, and sometimes that looks kinda strange to outsiders. But when Korg has to deal with someone rude while playing, Thor takes his headset and delivers a verbal lashing worthy of a true Norse god. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we got to see Thor fight a troll. Only instead of the rude, unhelpful, bridge-dwelling kind from Norse mythology, this was a more modern version of the story. This was honestly one of the greatest moments of the whole movie, and nobody threw any punches, activated any technology, or decapitated anyone. It was a moment that both Marvel movie fans and comic book buffs enjoyed, but was really the best for people who love bull. After journeying back to the Battle of New York along with Tony Stark, Scott Lang, and Bruce Banner, Steve Rogers ended up in an elevator in a scene which looked incredibly familiar. Mostly because it was nearly exactly the same as the infamous scene from Captain America: The Winter Soldier. That scene was one of the greatest Marvel movie moments of all time, but this one involved a lot less fighting and a lot more comic book references. He first tries to bluff the secret Hydra agents to get them to hand over the Infinity Stones, but that doesn't work. So Steve shows his allegiance by uttering the words, "Hail Hydra." This was a reference to an extremely controversial Marvel Comics storyline called Secret Empire. It revealed that Steve Rogers was a devoted Hydra agent until Allied forces manipulated his mind with a device called the Cosmic Cube. Needless to say, fans were livid to see the great hero Captain America proclaim his allegiance to the evil organization Hydra. This one may not be as deep of a callback as Hail Hydra, but it definitely still made us laugh. We know that the character Tony Stark has changed as a result of events which occurred in the MCU. After the Battle of New York, he was driven to create ULTRON after realizing his greatest fear, and he became Iron Man after seeing the destruction his weapons had caused. Then there are the more mundane changes, like giving up dairy, but according to Tony Stark, this change was made all the more difficult by the fact that beloved ice cream brand Ben & Jerry's had created a flavor in his honor called Stark Raving Hazelnuts. But Tony wasn't the only member of the Avengers to be honored by Ben & Jerry's. In Infinity War, Wong states that there's also a flavor called Hulka Hulka Burning Fudge. And it wasn't an especially important plot point, but in Avengers Endgame we actually got to see Bruce Banner chowing down on a container of Ben & Jerry's. And we can only assume it was the flavor created in his honor. Plus, although it looked like a normal pint-sized container at first glance, to fit into his Hulk-sized hand it had to have been a gallon of Ben & Jerry's. Talk about expensive. Oof. This Marvel movie moment brings up more questions than it answers, but we're not complaining. Honestly, sometimes it seems like Scott Lang is speaking for the audience. Anything prefaced with the word quantum flies right over his head, and he struggles to understand the intricacies of how time travel could actually work. And like a whole lot of us, he tries to substitute his lack of scientific knowledge with movie references. While he's trying to wrap his mind around the whole time travel thing and how the rules work in the MCU, he mentions many movies which have to do with time travel. Interestingly enough, a couple of these movies involve actors who are also members of the MCU. Michael Pena plays the role of Luis, and he's also in A Wrinkle in Time. And of course, Sebastian Stan portrays Bucky Barnes in the MCU, and is in the Hot Tub Time Machine. Do Michael Pena and Sebastian Stan exist in the MCU, or do Luis and Bucky have secret careers as actors? These are the real hard-hitting Marvel questions that we want to know the answers to. It's not easy to take note of every single tiny detail or Easter egg that gets packed into a Marvel movie, especially considering that the movie theater employees get irritated when you ask them to rewind the movie a little bit and then pause so you can examine something. In Avengers Endgame, we learned that Luis's van had ended up inside of a storage facility, which was overseen by a security guard played by Ken Jeong. It's no secret that the Russo brothers love Community, and they also love to include references to the show whenever possible. You might have also spotted actress Yvette Nicole Brown in an elevator with a security badge at some point in Endgame. But let's get back to Ken Jeong, who we saw reading a book for a brief second before attending to Scott Lang. If you missed it, the name of the book was Terminal Breach by J.G. Ballard, and it's a collection of short stories including one entitled Endgame. There's also a book with the same name written by Steve Bradshaw, which tells the story of a president who has to make a difficult choice which could result in millions of lives lost when the country's threatened. Not only do we pretty much have to love Morgan Stark because she's the daughter of our beloved Tony Stark, may he rest in peace, but there's no denying she's just a really cute kid. So it's not surprising that while attending Tony's funeral, Happy Hogan vowed to do whatever he could for little Morgan. But she had a request which might have seemed a bit strange at first, and without the proper context. Morgan tells Happy that she's hungry, and she wants cheeseburgers. Happy declares that he'll ensure Morgan has all the cheeseburgers she could ever want, but there's a reason she named that specific food. In Iron Man, a cheeseburger is what Tony wanted the most when he escaped from the cave and made it back to safety. And even that was a joke based on a real incident from Robert Downey Jr.'s life. Prior to getting cast as Iron Man, he struggled with addiction, but says he had a moment of clarity while eating a fast food burger from Burger King. According to him, the burger was so gross that it caused him to re-evaluate his life and clean up his act. There was a lot going on in Avengers Endgame, so if you weren't paying attention to all of the numbers that popped up, don't worry, we'll fill you in. We admit to being as confused as Scott Lang when Bruce Banner uses his various scientific instruments, but we did see a familiar number displayed while he was running some tests. That number was A113, which is familiar to Disney and Pixar fans. It shows up in pretty much every single Pixar movie, and it's a reference to a classroom at the California Institute of Arts. When listening to the message Tony Stark leaves for Pepper Potts, you might get hung up on the whole imminent death thing, but he does mention how long he's been floating through space. He says 21 and then corrects himself and says 22. That's because Endgame is the 22nd movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And when Thanos goes to the Garden, we learn it's called Planet O259S. The name doesn't really roll off the tongue, but it's a reference to the Avengers Volume 1, Edition 259, which featured Nebula and Captain America. Then we have the fact that Scott Lang's van ends up in a storage area labeled 616, which is a significant number to comic book fans. It's a nod to the Earth 616 comic book universe. Poor Black Widow, and we're not just saying that because she ended up falling to her doom off cliff on Vormir. At the beginning of the MCU, her character was often underutilized, and it seemed like nobody could agree on how she should be portrayed. At first, it seemed like she had a thing with Clint Barton until it was revealed that he had a secret family. Then there was the totally shoehorned-in romance between her and Bruce Banner, which we saw in Avengers Age of Ultron. She was able to calm him down and get him to transform from Hulk to Bruce Banner, and she also suggests the two of them run away together, despite the fact that they don't even seem to know each other particularly well. In Avengers Endgame, Bruce visits Thor, who's in something of a funk to put it mildly. He tells the God of Thunder that he's been in a tough spot before, and that someone helped him out of it. Thor jokingly asks if it was Natasha, and that he didn't find their romance any more convincing than the rest of us did. Right before Avengers Endgame hit theaters, it seemed like all anybody could talk about was the idea that Scott Lang would, shrink down, crawl inside a very uncomfortable part of Thanos, and, no, we're not talking about the backseat of a Volkswagen, and then grow large. But before that, fans were talking about the rear end of a different Marvel character, Captain America. Actor Chris Evans shared a poster which showed his posterior in great detail. When he posted it on Twitter, the website cropped the picture to give fans an even better look at this lovingly detailed area. So, needless to say, in Endgame, there were a lot of jokes about Captain America's rear end. While those were great, we think Marvel was trying to tell us something. At the end of the movie, we see old Cap sitting down, so we can't see if the super soldier serum prevented his butt from aging like the rest of us. Now, remember during Jurassic Park when Samuel L. Jackson's character says, "Hold on to your butts"? Samuel L. Jackson also plays Nick Fury, who showed up near the finale of Endgame. Clearly, Marvel Studios is trying to tell us to hold on to our butts and appreciate them while we still have them. Poor Rocket. He's had a rough life, and it hasn't been any easier considering people constantly mistake him for different creatures. At the beginning of Avengers Endgame, Tony Stark even admits he thought Rocket was a Build-A-Bear until he started talking. In Tony's defense, he was having some health issues at the time, but later on in Endgame, when he was feeling better, he called Rocket Ratchet. It could have been because Rocket was using tools, but it seemed more likely to be a reference to the Ratchet & Clank video game series. And before you Google what kind of animal is Ratchet, we'll save you some time. He's a fictional animal called a Lombax. Even in Guardians of the Galaxy, Star-Lord called Rocket a raccoon, and we learned Rocket doesn't even know what a raccoon is. But at least Star-Lord was closer than Thor, who called Rocket a rabbit. Now we're left wondering about the flora and fauna of the original Asgard after this joke from Endgame. When Thor and Rocket travel back in time to retrieve the Reality Stone from Asgard, the Asgardian soldiers also call Rocket a rabbit. What do the rabbits on Asgard even look like? If you're particularly observant or just a big fan of the Star Wars franchise, you may have noticed a strange trend that took place during Marvel's second phase of movies. Marvel Studios head Kevin Feige is admittedly a huge Star Wars fan and decided to pay tribute to the classic movie The Empire Strikes Back. As a result, every movie released during Phase 2 involves a character losing either a hand or an arm in loving memory of Luke Skywalker. In Iron Man 3, Aldrich Killian loses his arm while fighting against Tony Stark. And in Thor: The Dark World, Thor momentarily loses his hand when Loki pretends to chop it off. Bucky loses his arm during a flashback in The Winter Soldier, and Gamora rips Groot's arms off in Guardians of the Galaxy. There was also a great Star Wars tribute in Avengers Endgame when Nebula sacrificed her robot arm by reaching into the orb's container. It was a great movie moment combining two of our favorite fantasy franchises. Although he wasn't in Avengers Endgame long enough to make his usual jokes and pop culture references, we did get to have a few smiles involving Peter Parker. They didn't quite balance out all the crying we did on his behalf, but we'll take what we can get at this point. In Spider-Man Homecoming, Ned helps Peter disable the training wheels protocol on his Spider-Man costume. This unlocks an enhanced combat mode which features an instant kill ability. Needless to say, Peter is horrified and deactivates it immediately. However, when he's overwhelmed by Chitauri in Endgame, we saw him resort to the very same setting. This was also a cute callback to Captain America: Civil War. When Peter and Captain America met, Peter told Cap he was from Queens and asked where he was from. In Endgame, Captain America calls Peter Queens to get his attention when he throws Mjolnir. There's a fun moment of levity during a terrifying and epic battle, and it's definitely a more dignified name than Underoos. Apparently, Cap was paying attention while characters like Peter Parker and Scott Lang could barely contain their hero worship. One of the great debates following Avengers Infinity War was, who should we be the angriest at? Peter Quill for lunging at Thanos after he learned Gamora was gone and ruining the plan? Thor for not aiming for the head with Stormbreaker, which would have meant the decimation never happened? Or ourselves for being so emotionally invested in a superhero movie? No, definitely not that last one. But as angry as we were at the God of Thunder for majorly bungling this battle, it paled in comparison to how angry he was at himself. At the beginning of Avengers Endgame, Thor was positively sulking and mired in regret for his actions in Infinity War. While we don't blame him for feeling bad, a depressed Thor is a pretty sad sight. So obviously he's excited when the group heads out to find Thanos and he has a chance to make up for his previous blunder. After learning Thanos already destroyed the Infinity Stones and seemingly their only chance at undoing the decimation, he immediately chops his head off with Stormbreaker. It was definitely shocking, especially considering that this is a Disney movie. When asked what he was doing, Thor replies he aimed for the head this time. Earlier, we talked about the many jokes in Avengers Endgame about how Captain America's butt, nay, America's butt, simply refuses to quit. But that wasn't the only thing Steve Rogers just wouldn't quit during the movie. He also made a ton of references to past Marvel movies, and we have to admit we loved every last one of them. When he encounters his past self after the Battle of New York, that Steve tells him, "I can do this all day." This is the same thing a young Steve Rogers told a bully in the first Avenger, and what he told Tony Stark during Civil War. Apparently, he doesn't enjoy being on the receiving end of that statement, and it's not hard to see why. At least he got to look at his own butt after the fight. And when we see the touching goodbyes between Bucky Barnes and Steve Rogers, they default back to their old "don't do anything stupid" exchange. We might not know Clint Barton's family particularly well, mostly because they totally came out of nowhere. But we do know that Clint is quite fond of them. In fact, he even retires from being a superhero so he can spend more time with them and presumably reduce his chances of dying young. Of course, he went back to his old ways when his team needed him in Captain America: Civil War, a movie which ended up with him under house arrest. We wondered where Clint was in Avengers Infinity War, and the answer was apparently out in the middle of nowhere hanging out with his family. Of course, we see him training his daughter Lila Barton, who's totally not being set up to be the next Hawkeye or anything. It's an idyllic moment before the wife asks him a profoundly disturbing question, and wonders if he would like mayonnaise or mustard on his hot dog. Clint should definitely have known a terrible cosmic force was about to be unleashed, because who puts mayo on a hot dog? To make matters worse, one of his kids asks for ketchup on his hot dog. Clearly, the joke is that Clint's family has terrible taste in hot dog toppings. Was this included to make us feel less sad about them all being decimated? You decide. What was your favorite joke that took place in Avengers Endgame? Did it make our list, or did another moment make you laugh out loud? Share your favorite Endgame joke with us in the comments section below, and then click on that subscribe button for more videos from us here at CBR. Bye for now.